Hi guys, welcome to our fourth video for Unit 3 of America's Revolution in the Early Republic. Today we are going to be focusing on the American Revolution itself, right there. So we're actually not going to talk in great detail about a lot of the battles in the American Revolution. This is AP US history, which means we are a lot more concerned about the lead up to war and the results that come from war than we are about the actual battles and military history itself. So sorry if you're a big military history nerd. We're just not going to get too deeply into the battles themselves, but we'll talk a little bit about a couple of them today. Okay, so as usual, I want to start with a little bit of context here for this time period. So in our last video, we talked a little bit about sort of what was troubles that were really mounting and tensions that were really beginning to come to a head in the colonies. So we talked a little bit about the First Continental Congress and the first bloodshed of the war, Lexington and Concord. So that happens in April of 1775. Now, a month later is the meeting of the Second Continental Congress. Now, you might recall from the last video, I mentioned that at the first Congress, they had said, hey, we're going to meet again in a year. If things haven't gotten better, then we're really going to have to talk about the next steps, which is essentially what happened. Now, it's worthwhile noting that even at this point, at the Second Continental Congress, even though fighting had occurred and bloodshed had begun, there was definitely still resistance. There were still definitely conservative factions at the Congress that really did not want independence still. They believed that they should keep fighting to get Britain to back down and get to the king to agree to their demands. But ultimately, there were still many people who were saying, no, maybe not independence so much. But more and more of the Congress and the leaders and the people realized that independence might be necessary. And again, we talked in the last video about Thomas Paine's common sense and how more Americans were becoming convinced of independence as being the only option. So one thing the Second Continental Congress did do was selected George Washington as the supreme commander. At this point, right, there's skirmishes, there was the Lexington and Concord, they're fighting battles. So they need a commander. They select George Washington. Now, turns out George Washington was really great, but it was kind of an unexpected choice. I mean, at this point, Washington is 43 years old. He's a Virginian planter, wealthy, kind of aristocratic. And he was really chosen as a political move. He wasn't, he'd never had, achieved a very high level of command. He'd never been higher than colonel in the colonial militia. He'd never commanded larger than 1,200 men, and that had been 20 years before during the French and Indian War. So it was a little bit of a surprising and slightly controversial move, but honestly, it was really a political move. Increasingly, other regions of the American colonies were kind of distrustful of New England because they had really been kind of garnering this army and all this leadership was happening in the more kind of northern parts of the colonies. And more the southern parts of the colonies are feeling a little bit distrustful of them, and choosing someone like Washington, who was from Virginia himself, and the fact that he was upper class really made them feel that, okay, well, it isn't just going to be some rabble, and we're not trying to overturn the entire social system here, right? Okay, most of the colonial leaders were elites, and especially the Southerners, they didn't want to overturn the social status. They just really wanted to get rid of Britain. So George Washington was really chosen as a political move, but it turned out to be a really good one because George Washington, as it turns out, was a really able commander, and we'll talk about that again in a few minutes. So from April 1775 until July of 1776, when the colonies officially declared independence, there was sort of this very inconsistent war being fought because Americans, the Continental Congress, were simultaneously claiming, hey, we want to make amends with Britain. We want to come back together with them. We don't want this to go into a pitched battle or full-on war. They're trying to reconcile with Britain with the one hand, but on the other hand, they're also raising militias and appointing Washington as supreme leader, and they are preparing for war. So this is kind of hot and cold inconsistency is not doing a lot to convince Britain that they don't actually want a war. So the last kind of ditch attempt was the Olive Branch petition, which was sent in July 1775 by the Continental Congress to Britain to try to push for reconciliation, essentially begging him to say, no, 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 let's just come on, let's come together. George III would not have this, right? He absolutely denied it. In August of 1775, he said, nope, they're in a state of rebellion and they're going to learn what we do to rebels, essentially. So the king actually makes a move and meets with several German princes, and he hires in, thousands of foreign troops, mostly from the German area of Hesse. So the colonists called them the Hessians. So they were German foreign troops and mercenaries that were hired by the British, which was seen as like an enormous betrayal by the colonists, because clearly, that is a move that seemed very aggressive to them, and clearly they want to make war and treat these rebellious colonies, teach them a lesson. So, okay, so as we go into war, so what are the advantages and disadvantages of the colonists versus the British? So the British, at the outset, it seemed very obvious that the colonists were not going to win. The British had an enormous amount of military and financial resources to call upon. They had the largest, an enormous professional army and navy, one of the best navies in the world, if not arguably the best at the time. They also had the ability, as I mentioned, to hire foreign troops, which they did, the Hessian Germans. They could also tap into American loyalists. There were still colonial troops, colonial militia and loyalists within the colonies themselves. So the war for independence definitely split the colonies right down the middle. Even amongst families. Benjamin Franklin's son himself was a loyalist. He was the last royal governor of New Jersey. So this was by no means like a united area. Even though they were increasingly wanting independence, there were still loyalists to tap into. And the British also had a lot more Indian allies. And the truth be told, had Britain remained in control of the colonies, Native Americans probably would have fared a lot better than they did under the American government. But they had a lot of challenges too, right? First of all, the French, they had a great deal of animosity from the French. Okay, the French were just sort of waiting for an opportunity because they were bitterly humiliated from the French Indian War. And they really were just sort of waiting for an opportunity to sort of pay Britain back a little bit. And Britain itself was politically divided. In the English Parliament, you had the radical Whigs who almost were more likely kind of support the colonists. The Whigs saw the king and his ministers as tyrannical, rather like the colonists, and they really felt he needed to be checked. So they thought that if the king prevailed against the colonies, that then he would turn to Britain and become more tyrannical towards Britain itself. So some radical Whigs actually supported the colonists' cause. And they were also operating at an enormous distance, right? They were thousands of miles away from their home base. Their supplies were very far away. They often arrived partially or destroyed or were intercepted by colonists. So they were really far from their home base, and it was enormously expensive to have to move things across such a distance. And then the geographic span of the colonies was huge, and they had no single center to strike at. It wasn't like, France, for example, that had Paris, which was like the urban nerve center. There were a number of different urban centers along the colonies, across the span of the colonies, but no single one area. It's not like you could just cut the head off the snake. Because there were just so many different smaller centers across this enormous geographic span. So there wasn't one place they could strike and know if they could capture that, they could end the rebellion. The Americans, the advantages they had, despite having less resources to call on, they did have outstanding leadership. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin was an extraordinarily able diplomat that helped secure French support. They also were able to call upon European officers, a lot of European officers. The colonial militia were very much lacking in leadership, and they were able to hire a lot of European officers who were impoverished and needed money. So they definitely traded their swords for pay, including the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, not impoverished, but a kind of ideological young, French gambler, so to speak, that came and was his appointment as a general in the militia of the American troops was largely political, but, he was, vital in securing French aid. Also, America was agriculturally self-sustaining. They had home base defense advantage. They were defending their own homes, and they could call upon the enormous agricultural resources of the Americas, of the British colonies. But they were badly organized. Okay, the colonial militia were spread out and fairly poorly organized. The Continental Congress itself was pretty disjointed and didn't agree on everything. And they just had less money and a lot less trained professional troops. Again, rely on that colonial militia, which, sometimes really well trained, sometimes not so much. So they really, really needed the help of those European officers to kind of get those troops in line. And in fact, Baron von Steuben, who was a German officer who drilled the troops at Valley Forge, was actually sort of responsible for getting many of those troops in line. Okay, so why did the Americans ultimately prevail? Like I said, we're going to skip over most of the actual battles and stuff and talk about why the Americans ultimately won this war. So spoiler, if you didn't know, we did win. Okay, so there were two important battles that we'll talk about. The first one is the Battle of Saratoga. This was really very much a turning point. Up until the Battle of Saratoga, the American troops had a lot of losses and reverses. Washington managed this pretty well. I mean, they were very good at doing a kind of calculated retreat and not falling into massive pitched battles with the British that could just wipe out their army in one go. But there was a lot of reverses, a lot of retreat up till the Battle of Saratoga. I mean, we had this horrible winter in which, you may have remembered from earlier history classes, Washington's troops were at Valley Forge and had everything, had virtually nothing. We're short of pretty much everything except misery, I think your book calls it, refers to it that way. So really terrible winter, starvation, lack of morale. But in October 1777, Burgoyne's 7,000 troops were forced to surrender in upstate New York. And this is a huge boost not only to American morale, but really importantly, it convinced the French after this major victory, okay, the colonists do have a chance. It's worthwhile aiding them. We're not just going to be making a greater enemy of the British. We can aid them. They may actually win, and this would definitely reap us some benefit. So it really does help to ultimately convince the French to send aid to the colonists. And then, of course, the Battle of Yorktown was sort of the final major battle of the Revolution, which was in October of 1781. Lord Cornwallis's army essentially became trapped in Yorktown on Chesapeake Bay. Now, he relied on the British Navy to protect him. He was out right on the bay. And unfortunately, this is one of the few times of the war in which the British Navy was not dominant. The French Navy swooped in, and Washington recognized this opportunity and kind of marched really quickly his troops about 300 miles from New York to Chesapeake area. And American troops and French troops under Washington attacked by land. Cornwallis's army was attacked by sea from the Navy. They were holed up, they were bottled, they were separated from the British Navy, so they couldn't actually get out. And they were forced to surrender. Now, again, it was only a force of about 7,000. There were still 34,000 British troops in the North American colonies, but we do tend to consider this sort of the decisive ending battle of the war. It didn't actually end things. They were still fighting for another year. But a lot of the heart had gone out of it. I mean, the British were really sick of fighting. Okay, there was no longer a lot of support for this war at home. So there were some really decisive factors that basically led to the victory of the colonists. And the biggest one was the aid of the French. I mean, probably without the French, I don't know, it would have been very difficult to win this war without the French. George Washington's leadership. Now, he was not the most brilliant military strategist or mind, but I mean, he was wonderful, but he wasn't that he was the most brilliant military strategist in the world. He was just an amazing leader. He had the kind of leadership and charisma and that was able to really convince people to follow them, make people want to follow him and fall under his leadership. And he really had an amazing ability to unite people and unite the troops. And then just the ideological commitment of the colonists and the political division in Britain, okay? Because like I said, those radical Whigs really did not, and they might have been a minority voice in the British Parliament, but they absolutely did not support this war in the North American colonies. And in fact, just before sort of the very end of the war in 1782, the Tory government is going to end or not fall out of power in the parliament. Now, the Whig the Whig faction will become the dominant one only for a few months, actually, when the Treaty of Paris is signed in 1783. But it's enough time for the Whig to write really favorable terms for the colonists. So the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, and this offered extraordinarily favorable terms. In fact, not only did the colonists get their 13 colonies, but also the entire kind of Ohio River Valley area, that whole area that had been fought over for the French and Indian War. I mean, that didn't really belong to the colonists. They'd only captured a small segment of it, and it was basically just handed to them by the British, by the Whig government at the time, who wanted to basically keep the colonists from becoming more closely entrenched and allied with the French. So ultimately, by the end of the war, 1783, we see this kind of green area. You can see on the map, this all belongs or has become American territory now. As you can see, there's disputed areas, and there will be disputed areas. And the Whig government in Britain won't last more than a few months, and their Tory successors who come back in power are not going to be super friendly to the new American nation. And later on in Unit 4, we're going to talk about some of those challenges. But either way, the war officially ends in 1783 and with a colonial victory. So we're going to talk more about the impact of this in the next video, the impact of revolutionary ideas. So I'll talk to you guys about that next time.